All right, this is a very, very fun one, a very, very cool one. This one makes use of the arpeggiator, and as you might expect, the arpeggiator is really, really good for pumping out arpeggios. And if you're not familiar with an arpeggio or what that is, I'm happy to tell you right now, it's basically a chord that is rolled. So what I'm trying to say here is, instead of, if I play a chord like this, you notice that all three notes play. That's D, F, and A minor chord. Now, if I play that as an arpeggio, it's the same thing, D, F, and A, but we're rolling the chord. And then go to a G chord. So that's an arpeggiation. That's just kind of a fancy Italian word composers use for when we play a chord rolled or in a sequence of individual notes and not simultaneously, not held together at the same time. Okay, so as promised, we're going to use this arpeggiator device that comes with Logic Pro. Logic Pro, and I think it was 2 updates ago, they added this whole different section here called MIDI effects. And under this MIDI effects section, you've got all of these different MIDI effects. And they're all very, very cool, and they can do a lot of different, very unique things. It was actually a really, really good addition overall to their stock tools. But in particular, let's talk about this arpeggiator. Here's what it looks like. And you'll notice it's got a sequence very similar to what you've seen before in certain drum machines and that sort of thing. It's got this rate here where you can tell the sequencer subdivision, what beat subdivision to read. It's got different options for whether the chord should simply be going up repeatedly, whether the chord is going down repeatedly, whether the chord is going from the bottom to the top and then back down right here. Now, over here at the bottom, we can draw in these different steps or these different events in the arpeggiator. And you'll notice that as I draw them in, the custom length happens here, which is fine, which is good. Sometimes you want one that's really detailed and goes all the way through 16/16 notes. Sometimes you just want it to repeat just 8/16 notes, which would make perfect sense. Now, in live mode, I'll show you real quick. If I hold down live, I'm going to hold down only 2 notes, and you're going to see simply 2 notes. Then I'm going to hold down a 3rd note, and you can see it's arpeggiating all 3 of those notes. I'm going to turn the variation 1, because we'll talk about this one in just a second. And if I add a 4th note, and you'll notice they're all just ascending from the bottom to the top. Now, if I go with this option, they're all going to be descending. And this one's going to go from the bottom to the top and then back down. We're not going to get any further into the depth of these right here. You can certainly research those on your own. There's plenty of information out there about how to use the arpeggiator on itself. I want to get to the actual tricks here. So I'm going to switch back over to this grid mode where I've basically created this sequence of arpeggio strikes as well as velocities per strike. So for instance, I could get rid of this one entirely or get rid of this one entirely, right? Which is pretty cool. Now you'll notice the other thing that I've done here is I actually have this chord symbol. You'll notice that it has like 3 dots written the way that you would see in standard notation. When you punch that on, what it's going to do is it's going to make sure that the entire chord does play simultaneously. So for instance, if I put them all on, you're going to hear that D, F, and A, that D minor chord, repeated. Right? But if I get rid of some of them, you'll notice that only 16th note 1, 16th note 3, and 16th note 7 are being activated as an entire chord. The other thing I want to show you before we go on here is that we can create some random variations, which is actually pretty cool. So you might want to play with these a little bit. It's really hard to explain what might be happening sort of mathematically or in terms of the algorithms of the plugin underneath the hood of this thing. But you'll notice going from here to here to here, that it's creating some different variations. Now, the other thing that I can show you is that the octave range can actually be controlled as well. So all of those hits, as it were in the same octave. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bump it up to 2 octaves, and you're going to notice that it will now scroll through 2 octaves with this variation. Which is a very, very cool automated system of writing. Instead of having to write in a whole bunch of MIDI data in order to get that rising arpeggio feel, we can actually hit a single chord, have the arpeggiator play through that sequence, and we get this nice detailed rising arpeggio line. You'll notice that something like this is great and most appropriate for genres like trance or progressive. So what I've done here, you can see, is I've written in 2 chords. I've written a simple chord progression. We're just going from a D minor, which would be D, F, and A, to an A chord, which will actually be in what we would call second inversion, meaning that the notes are flipped. Instead of them being in root position where the A would be at the bottom and the C sharp is in the middle and the E is at the top, we've instead gone to the closest inversion, which is actually a more musical sound. Now, if that confuses you, don't worry about it. I just want to show you we're going from a D minor chord to an A chord. Okay, so let's have a listen to that. Right, so we're already onto something, which is pretty darn cool. So the ARP is playing off of this pluck, I called it basically, which is just a one oscillator with a sawtooth. Nothing too crazy there. You'll notice that I've got the amp envelope for it real tight to kind of get that staccato effect out of the line. And I'm getting this rising ARP from it. Now here's what I would do next. I would actually bring that same MIDI data here or bring that same MIDI data here. But what we're going to do today is I've taken the liberty of, on the mid pluck, I'll play and solo that momentarily. On the mid pluck, I've taken the liberty of writing a different ARP sequence. And instead of it being set to 16th notes, this one is set to 8th notes. Got my variation here, but it's all in the same octave. I don't want this thing jumping too much. This is almost like a repetitious chord stab like you'd hear from a piano or a guitar, just playing that rhythmic backbone. And that is coming off Silent with a very simple pluck sound again. So without the ARP, you'd have just... right? So even though that these seem to have quite a lot of sustain, because of the amp envelope we're using for them, you'll notice that the release is set way tight. So we're getting a great deal of attack, but then it's letting off very quickly. Now, if I put the ARP on with this 8th note sequence, we get this sort of thing. Okay? Same sort of concept down here, but instead I've used this pad sound. Now, I decided to throw a curveball on this one and use something a little bit different, maybe something a little esoteric, maybe something a little odd and sort of off the beaten path that we haven't seen too often. This is a synth called Surge, and it's a Swedish-made synth, and it never really picked up in huge popularity the way that maybe Massive or Silent did. But I gotta tell you, man, I love this thing. It has some really unique sounds, and it's highly programmable, and it comes with just a super ton of sounds that you can start with and presets that you can edit and save to your liking. But this is actually a pad sound. Now I have the arpeggiator off in this particular case, so let's just listen to what this pad would sound like. Which I have to admit on its own doesn't really do much for me. Now let's turn this ARP on and let the sequence I punched in go to town for me. I have to be honest, I love it. And in the future, I could see myself routing that pad sound out, or that particular pad pluck, we should call it, out to a distortion device and really getting some grit and some energy and aggression and vibe out of that line. Right now, this is, it's kind of good on its bare bones, but it's not exactly a super standout sound. It's just kind of ready to be treated. Okay, so you could easily copy all that data, but what we're going to do this time is we're simply going to have this particular sound, and this particular sound sort of grouped together. Now, the way you would do something like that is to hit and hold Command and select the 3 tracks that they're on. Then, hold Control and click, create track stack. We're going to hit create, and then all 3 of these tracks simply get sent to this summing track. So if I show you on the mixer, what I have here is all 3 of those individual tracks and sounds that we talked about, but now they're coming through this summing channel. So I'm going to go ahead and unsolo that one initial pluck sound. I'm going to dump this MIDI data down to that sum 1 track. I'm going to show you the mixer again, and what you'll notice when I hit play, they all, again, have their individual thing going on, but they're all getting summed through this track stack. So if I solo the track stack, we hear all three sounds. Now again, the pluck pluck, sort of the top main pluck, this chord kind of stab pluck, and then this gated sounding pad pluck. All right, now hitting solo, I get, again, all three of them. And there are benefits to that, right? So now they're sort of summed. So as far as mixing, if you can get their relative levels between the three sounds like you want, then you can control them all with one fader. That's typical aux or auxiliary summing. One thing that a lot of people at this point would do is simply bring up a compressor and smash all of those together. Which compressors are oftentimes used like that on auxiliaries to create a sort of glue where the three sounds are then squashed in terms of their dynamics together and they start to play nice. So that's just a little aside in one way to do it with the track stacks. Now this is especially helpful if the MIDI data is going to be the same for all three tracks. For instance, if I have this one here, I could copy, yeah, and then I have all this MIDI data running around. But let's say all three of those lines are simply going to play the same thing. You just put it here on this sum track and it'll trigger all three of the sounds. And it's just really nice keeping your arrangement window from getting bogged down with too many regions and too many tracks and just too much craziness. You can also use this disclosure triangle to close that sum channel up and all three of these disappear and run in the background, which is cool. But as you know, I tend to like to have a little more control over things. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit H, I'm going to hide my sum track, and I'm going to unhide all of this right here that I've done. And I'm going to unmute it as well. Go ahead and get rid of those. And all of this pink stuff right here that you're looking at is virtually identical to what I just showed you, but I want to show you the difference in the MIDI. This particular first one here, this pluck pluck as I called it, has the D chord followed by the A chord. But in this next one, I didn't want all that MIDI data, so I got rid of the top two notes. I really just wanted those bottom two notes to kind of carry the bottom of the phrase. And then I decided that I wanted to also do that here. So you'll notice that all three of the tracks have different MIDI going on in them, which is fine. So what I've got is I've got my pluck pluck going on, I've got my mid pluck going on, and I've got my pad pluck going on. Now I'm going to have all three of those going on. And just like that, I've got a very, very cool compositional thing happening. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to demo this against a completed progressive trance type loop, and you can see how appropriate this type of sound would be for that kind of track. So there you have it, sort of a crash course on how to use the arpeggiator to creative effect. Let's get a little bit more into this in the next video. I just want to show you how I might treat each one of these individual tracks with its own sound design elements.